Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our April 13th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler. Today, we're going to check in with a central Iowa entrepreneur who's growing a company that uses algae to treat wastewater and create fertilizer with the help of Iowa Farm Bureau. And later in the episode, we'll discuss today's crop and livestock market dynamics with Iowa Farm Bureau's market experts, economist Dr. Christopher Pudenz, and Farmer Education Program Manager Zach Brummer. But let's get started with Dr. Martin Gross, who is the co-founder and CEO of Gross-Wen Technologies, a central Iowa company with an innovative trademarked system that uses algae to treat wastewater and create fertilizer. As Iowa tackles the challenge of protecting water quality and supplying our crops with the fertilizer they need to grow, we know we'll need system-wide solutions that tap into rural and urban opportunities. That's part of what makes Gross-Wen's story so compelling. Gross-Wen is a company that Iowa Farm Bureau has been actively supporting since its inception, and I recently had a chance to sit down with Dr. Gross to talk about what's on the horizon for his team. My first experience with your company is when you opened up and hosted a tour for Iowa Farm Bureau staff in September of 2024, and you gave a deep dive into where your company's been, what your vision is. Tell us a little bit about Gross-Wen Technology and yourself and your background.
It all started when I was getting my graduate degree at Iowa State University. I'm a PhD biosystems engineering, and I have a PhD in food science and technology. So when I was at Iowa State 12 years ago now, we came up with a new way to grow microalgae. So think of algae as a crop, similar to corn and soybean, other than these are little microscopic things that float around in the water. Back in that time, there was a lot of interest in how do you make algae as the crop of the future, right? Algae doesn't need fertile land. Algae can grow in the middle of the desert. It sounds great, right? At that time, there's a lot of interest in algae to biofuels. There's energy independence we were looking at. How can we produce our own transportation fuels here in the United States in areas where we can't grow corn and soybean? We're lucky in Iowa. We've got the best land in the world, but there's a lot of area in the U.S. that doesn't have good land. And what can you grow there? And the answer is algae can be grown in the middle of the desert. So at that time, we were looking at, when I was at Iowa State, ways to grow that algae cost effectively. And we came up with a new algae cultivation system at that time and pretty quickly found that algae biofuels were cost prohibitive. But what we realized was algae is really good at cleaning water, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus from water. And there's a lot of need for that in the world today. So we kind of pivoted halfway through, used that same system that we developed to grow algae cost effectively, to instead of the main product being algae, the main product is cleaning water. The algae becomes a byproduct. So then I graduated from Iowa State in 2016 and started GWT.
I know you found a great home here in Slater, Iowa, in central Iowa. So can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with the city of Slater, how that started, and what your solution is for them?
Yeah, well, listen, water quality, nitrogen, phosphorus pollution comes from all different angles, right? Unless they're treated, they are going to cause environmental issues. Same for parks and cities and runoff. Those are more difficult ways to treat. But at a wastewater treatment plant, you have a pipe that goes into the river, and that's the ideal place. If you're going to tackle the nitrogen phosphorus pollution, there's a pipe that can be treated. Same challenge with agriculture. Agriculture has rain events, water, nitrogen, phosphorus end up put on the field to grow the crop, and we try to keep it there as best we can. And tremendous practices being developed really across the world on retaining that, and practices like buffer strips and whatnot. But at the end of the day, this is a big area. A city rainfall, washing it off on the streets, cropland. These are difficult areas to try to treat. So what has happened is there's permits that are being regulated on, okay, if you have a pipe that goes into the river like a wastewater treatment plant has, those are the ideal locations to try to target and hedge that pollution issue. And that's what happened in Slater. They got a new regulation saying that they needed to treat the water better today than they did yesterday. And what that meant is they needed to upgrade their wastewater plant.
Since I was privy to taking a tour of your facility, I have this visual of what it looks like because I got to see it, and it was fascinating. I know our staff was really impressed to see that cutting-edge technology. Your water quality treatment facility seemed to just be an ideal fit for Slater.
Yeah, so, if you can close your eyes and envision this, it's vertical conveyor belts that are about 10 feet tall, and these belts are slowly rotating into the water, out into the open air, and just think of vertical treadmills, essentially, is the way I'd say it. These belts continuously rotate into the water, out into the open air, and what happens on these belts is algae begins to form a film. So if you're walking around a farm pond, for example, you see a rock or pebble that has a green film on it.
Yeah.
That's algae. Mm-hmm. Algae likes to attach to surfaces. So we leaned into that approach and encouraged the algae to attach to these belts that are continuously rotating. So if you envision our system, it's vertical conveyor belts, algae attached on the surface of those belts. And as that algae grows, it's actually eating the nitrogen and phosphorus out of the water and growing algae biomass. And then we periodically scrape the algae off the surface of those belts. And when you do that, you're removing that nitrogen, phosphorus-rich algae from the system, effectively cleaning the water. Now on Slater specifically, we do have installation in the city of Slater where they're using our system to meet their nitrogen permit at the city. So if we take a step back and think, okay, in Iowa, what's going on, or in the Midwest, and really across the world, what's going on, wastewater treatment plants have to clean the water better than they used to. Less nitrogen, phosphorus can leave those facilities than they used to years ago. Mm-hmm. So Slater, like any of the other rural communities in the state of Iowa, are getting stricter permits, and they were kind of at a crossroads. They could either get rid of their lagoon facility. So, if any of the listeners drive past a small town and see a big open, usually rectangular square pond.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common.
I think there's 600 of these in the state of Iowa alone and, 1,000 of them throughout the U.S. That's a really simple, easy, inexpensive, low operating complexity way to treat water. It's perfect for a rural community where the person operating that facility is the same one that's pushing snow and mowing the parks. There's that type of technology that's there, and that's what Slater had. And they were in a crossroads because they were either going to have to retrofit that lagoon or build a brand new treatment plant, similar to how Des Moines treats the water in a mechanical complex, a lot of process control, college educated people need to operate those type of facilities. And Slater got these new permits and they're like, I think we need to do a mechanical plant. And that's when we came in. We said, hey, how about instead of getting rid of your infrastructure that does a lot of good things, let's retrofit it with our system. And effectively what it ended up doing is we saved them $1 million in capital cost for the facility.
Wow.
And then simplified that process with less operating costs than that mechanical, small packaged, mechanical plant that they were looking at. So really win-win for the city, spending less money on sewer bills, but also the people that live in these rural communities. One of the struggles is as they get stricter nitrogen phosphorus permits, guess who pays for that? The folks in the small towns.
Yeah.
The rural communities get that burden even more than the large cities because there's economies of scale, like many things here, that doesn't scale down very well, more cost at the small facilities. So by saving them $1 million, that effectively improves the sewer treatment rates for those facilities as well, making them a better place to live and grow a family, which, I'm a small town Iowa guy myself, and, I get how that's impactful for these type of cities.
Yeah, that's what really impressed me is, you had this challenge and something needed to be done about it, and you found an opportunity to retrofit, improve the practice, and save some costs. And then also you mentioned on the belts where the algae is growing and then you scrape it, there's a value add there.
Yep. Usually in wastewater treatment, it's a true cost center. There's no revenue coming back to the city. This is a necessary evil. We need to clean the water before we send it to the environment. There's no money, revenue opportunities here. Mm-hmm. You're using bacteria or chemicals conventionally to treat the water, and you produce bacterial sludge, chemical sludge. That's a cost to dispose of. Now, if you look at our system, it's kind of got a paradigm shift, right? Instead of producing bacteria and chemical sludge, we're producing algae biomass. And we'll actually buy that algae from the municipality, or we also treat water at food and beverage processors, for example. But we'll grow that algae, clean the water. That's the primary value driver, but there's algae biomass that comes out of the process as well. We'll actually buy that back, so the cities get revenue from the algae that we produce. We then take that that algae and we make it into slow release fertilizer products. So that product's really good at the local park in that community can use, the nitrogen and phosphorus that's in that wastewater. We can actually capture that nitrogen and phosphorus in the wastewater, reuse it at the local community to fertilize the parks and golf courses. The other product that we produce, and we'll be rolling out in the next year or so, is using that same algae that's produced, but for a different purpose. The purpose is soil amendment. So we've done 2 years of field trials using this algae as a soil amendment for corn, wheat, alfalfa, potatoes. And what we found is you can actually have a higher yield when you apply this alongside your conventional fertilizers. You can actually increase your yield by improving soil health at your facility, which is really exciting for us. So that fertilizer product is where we started. Soil amendment's even more valuable. And then, looking into the future, and I mentioned this before, our start in algae was, let's make algae into biofuels. And we have a partnership with Chevron. They're an investor in our business where they're interested, again, in taking that algae that we use to clean the water. Let's make biofuels out of it. Specifically, their interest is sustainable aviation fuel. So you're cleaning the waste. That's the service you're providing. Now you have algae to produce fertilizers and fuels. It's a really nice story.
It's a great story. And in agriculture, we're hearing so much now about regenerative agriculture and just looking at the cyclical nature of production and how you can find that value add. And it sounds like you've absolutely tapped into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at our soil amendment products specifically and what we can do for agriculture is some of the trials that we ran this past year is we reduced the nitrogen fertilizer rate on the corn crop and added our system. So we reduced fertilizer by 25% and added our algae in, and we still beat the yield with full fertilizer. That's pretty incredible, especially with fertilizer prices and, uncertainty and, all the conflict in the Middle East right now. It's, if you can reduce input costs while maintaining or increasing yield, that's a really exciting place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly, as you mentioned, with global uncertainty, particularly with the conflict over in the Strait of Hormuz and not knowing what's going to happen there. I know a lot of farmers that we've talked to had already purchased fertilizer for the 2026 growing season. But looking ahead, there's a lot of uncertainty. And as farmers are struggling to generate a profit, that input cost on the fertilizer is huge. So they're probably looking for every opportunity to try to scale back.
Yep. And this product we're hoping to roll it out here in the next year and a half. And perhaps you can find it at the local distributor and in the short term.
So on these trials, I know you've been doing some field trials on the fertilizer. Are there any new uses or things that you're looking at or any trials that are in the works?
Really on the algae side, it's really digging into the soil amendment. I think there's just so much opportunity. This market is massive. I mean, row crop agriculture is everywhere. So as we have more and more of our installations, there's only so much turf grass fertilizer or, the biofuels opportunities down the road. So it's really digging in, making sure that, when we apply this as a soil amendment, that we know that we're providing that positive return for the farmer. I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's what the trials are all about, is making sure under a lot of different situations, we still have that positive impact, or identifying the ones where we have the best impact to provide the returns for the farmers.
That's outstanding. And I'm sure over the 10 years that you've been doing Gross-Wen Technology, you've taken some turns and twists into where you thought you'd want to go, but it all comes down to that algae and that product and what it can do for water treatment. And it almost sounds like it's icing on the cake to find this additional value add on the backside.
Yeah, absolutely. Our goal, the whole path of GWT was, let's focus on being a really reliable, cost-effective water treatment solution to start with. But then let's maximize the value of that algae. And our goal is, if we're going to make, let's say, $5 per kilogram for the algae for soil amendment versus 25 cents per kilogram for the fertilizer, we want to pass that along to our customers' water treatment, effectively further reducing the treatment costs for our customers. Our goal is we want to price out bacterial and chemical-based solutions, but what effectively that does is now provides even better cost competitive solutions for our customers, these rural communities, large cities, and food processors that would use our system, even more cost effective for them to keep rates down at the end of the day.
Yeah. Pasco, Washington, I believe, is a new city that you guys are operating in. And I've heard some folks make some parallels to communities in Iowa because they have some agri-processors there as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, Pasco project's a fantastic project for us. First of all, it's the largest algae-based wastewater treatment system in the world.
Wow.
And this site is not too unique. I mean, there's a number of these type of campuses across Iowa where a number of food processors are organized in a park or a site where there's just efficiencies to be next to them. Think of these Cargill facilities or ADM facilities where Cargill's making a product and then the end user of that product is co-located. So there's these sites where there's a number of processors at one location. That's the same in Pasco. Pasco has 5 different vegetable processors. It's brilliant to go out there because, I'm an Iowa guy and you see cornfields and soybean fields everywhere there. It's like there's potatoes, there's bell peppers, there's onions, these are all being grown, processed at a centralized facility. There's 5 companies there and their water ends up needing to be treated for nitrogen. This is a nitrogen project as well. So all the water comes together, goes to an anaerobic digester to treat first. So they're producing enough power, don't quote me on this, but for like 5,000 homes.
Wow.
Enough natural gas, renewable natural gas, off of the water from those processors. After the digestion process, it goes into our algae system where we remove enough nitrogen so then all that water can be land applied to fertilize the crops for the next growing season. They call it industrial symbiosis, and the idea is there's energy left in that water, there's nutrients left in that water, let's recycle, reuse them, and sustain that process on site at the facility. Same thing can be done at the processors here in the Midwest that have similar challenges and opportunities to do that.
Yeah, so it sounds like that's a model that could apply in other communities as well.
You bet.
Your journey as an entrepreneur. Obviously, you've got the educational background, the research, the sciences, but then to take this idea and actually become an entrepreneur, to try to take it and run. What has that been like, and who are some folks that have helped you along the way, or some advice that you might have for other ag entrepreneurs?
I think I'm like a lot of us where you have an idea, you have a technical expertise. Like my technical expertise is weird. It's in algae. When you go to school or if you're working for a company, there's not training on how to become an entrepreneur. It's just a different business. It's a different skill set. So I was fortunate enough when I graduated from Iowa State that I got a really great network. And at Iowa State and University of Iowa was the same. We got involved with a program called the Startup Factory at Iowa State. And it was really just training to say, okay, you have this technical expertise, you have this idea. How do you start a business, grow a business? And it was like the technical training that was so important for me to learn how to do it. Ag Entrepreneurship Initiative at Iowa State, led by Kevin Kimley and others. I was able to get into a network of folks that have done it before, and they trained me in a lot of different skills that I didn't realize I needed, and an understanding of how entrepreneurship works. Those folks that I met along the way, the mentors, whether it was Kevin Kimley at the Ag Entrepreneurship Initiative or another guy, Dave Furbush, which is our first investor into the business, just taught me so much about, how to run a business, how to grow a business, how to fundraise in a business. Is just really great network in Iowa, central Iowa specifically.
And I've heard folks mention that Iowa kind of has this ag innovation ecosystem with various different folks. You mentioned the assistance Iowa State was able to provide. I know the Iowa Economic Development Authority has an innovative program for folks like yourself. Is that something that you took advantage of as well?
Yeah, absolutely. What I accessed through the university, Iowa Economic Development Authority, they have great programs to help support new innovative ideas that benefit the Iowa economy. I mean, that's really why they're funding these. So we're able to take advantage of those programs. I'd say a really great investor network. So one of our biggest investors in the business is a Rural Vitality Fund led by Adam Koppes.
And that's a Iowa Farm Bureau program.
Absolutely. So really where the ecosystem's great is you get all these different pieces and they have their networks within them. So here in Iowa, we do agriculture better than anyone else. Well, that's a big part of our business as well. So getting involved with Farm Bureau and Adam and the crew there, it's like their network about how we can help solve problems here in the Midwest, and the network that you need to really make the introductions is phenomenal. Obviously the capital's needed to grow fast, efficiently, but just that network is incredible.
Yeah. Instead of just going out blindly trying to find out who do I talk to, it sounds like the Rural Vitality Fund and through their networks is able to connect you with the right folks. And if they don't have the answer, they can probably point you to somebody that does.
You could just use an example of one thing that recently happened is we're entering a space to treat water at ethanol facilities. And I call Adam up. I say, hey, this looks like a really good market for our technology. And guess what? He opened 3 doors for us, talked to those ethanol plants, understand really, what do they need first of all, and then we refined our message and value proposition. But that's, one example of of many of, people in Iowa tend to be nice and open doors, but if you don't know the people you need to be talking to, there's an efficiency loss. So Adam and others have been instrumental in our story at GWT.
And there's so many great stories out there, and it's not a short, direct path as an entrepreneur, I'm sure. And I know Farm Bureau has been involved with GWT since, I believe, 2016 is when they jumped on board with some investment. And, a lot's changed in the last decade. And I'm sure the next decade looking forward is going to be even more exciting with all of these opportunities that you've got ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's like if you think about the path of an entrepreneur, is like oftentimes you know or you think you know where you need to get to. And it's just a matter of how windy that road is to get there. Because, a lot of the time when you're starting something new, doing something that's never been done, there's not a blazed path. There's no straight road to get there. So oftentimes like these network through, Rural Vitality Fund or others and the folks that help guide you, it's really just about straightening that path. We're going to take detours. We're going to go in directions that are a waste of time. But ultimately, if you can have the right network and the right ecosystem around you, which is what I feel is really good here, you can straighten that road, clean the path, straight path to the solution that you need to get to.
Yeah. So many people think of the Silicon Valley or other areas as being these great hotspots for startups, but we have some great ag entrepreneurism going on right here in Iowa.
The things that you see spun out of the universities is top notch. The challenge in Iowa, it's been a challenge for years, is the amount of capital that's dedicated. People in Silicon Valley generally, it's a different type of agriculture in California than we have here, but the solutions that need to be here in the Midwest, the row crop agricultural solutions, like the people here in Iowa know how to implement those solutions. So it's like you have such a head start if you're developing the technology here. The problem is, at a certain point, you need an amount of capital to grow the business efficiency. And that's really where Iowa can do better. And there's been a lot of progress over the past 10 years on creating new funds and opportunities to finance these type of initiatives to help the ecosystem. But that's the biggest opportunity. If we want to grow the ecosystem in Iowa, it's a capital deal. The ideas, the workforce, it's all here. You just need the capital to really turbocharge it.
That's a really good point. And you might be at the place with Gross-Wen Technologies right now where needing that next investment and looking at what growth is going to look like. So looking ahead for you guys, what do you have on the horizon? What new opportunities lie ahead?
One of the big things that we just closed on is a new round of fundraising for GWT. So in the startup world, you think there's an angel investor, a seed investor, Series A, Series B. Anyway, as you go up in the letters, it's later stage business. So we're actually doing our Series B. We're raising $20 million to grow the business even faster. And we just closed our lead investor. It's a global water company, largest water business in North America. They led the investment round, and we'll actually have a commercial agreement with them to sell as an OEM in certain markets with them. So not public yet, but I think if you keep an eye out, you'll see a press release coming out in the next month or so.
Well, congratulations. That's very exciting. And I'd encourage folks, if listeners ever have the opportunity to go and visit the facility, it really is impressive and it's eye-opening. And I'm sure you get that every time you give a tour. People are probably just always blown away with the vision and the execution of it, and perhaps most importantly, what the future holds. It wouldn't work for every community or every city, but the ones that it's a natural fit for, I think it seems like a great solution, and you've experienced some success.
Absolutely. And, for any of the listeners, just go to algae.com. You can take a look at what it all looks like. And definitely, if you have a question, there's a portal on there to, reach out with interest as well. I really am a passionate Iowan. I love the causes that Farm Bureau Rural Vitality Fund, the fund that invested us with Adam Koppes, and what they've provided to GWT, which is just really, we have that windy path. Let's straighten it out and make it as efficient as possible. So thanks to you all that have been a big part of our vision throughout the years.
Thanks, Martin. It's been fun to watch Gross-Wen grow over the past decade, and we're excited to support the next step in the company's evolution. If you'd like to learn more about Gross-Wen Technologies and how they're using algae for sustainable wastewater treatment, visit algae.com. That's ALGAE.com. And if you're a rural entrepreneur who's interested in the kind of support that Iowa Farm Bureau could provide you, we'd encourage you to reach out to Iowa Farm Bureau's Senior Investment Manager, Adam Koppes. Iowa Farm Bureau has worked alongside entrepreneurs to grow their businesses for decades. So if you've got a business you're looking to take to the next level, find Adam's email address down in the notes for this podcast episode and be sure to reach out. Next up, we have a couple of Spokesman Speaks regulars, Iowa Farm Bureau economist Dr. Christopher Pudenz and Farmer Education Program Manager Zach Brummer. Christopher and Zach have been traveling a lot the last few months, crisscrossing the state to share crop and livestock market updates with Iowa farmers. Zach also took a group of Iowa Farm Bureau members down to Texas for a first-hand look at some of the most pressing challenges facing the U.S. cattle industry. Spokesman reporter Corey Munson recently sat down with Zach and Christopher to recap those recent experiences and discuss their thoughts on crop and livestock markets in the months ahead.
Christopher and Zach, I understand that you both recently participated in a series of regional meetings across the state. Can you take a few minutes and kind of share with our listeners what the purpose of those meetings were, what the format was?
Yeah, they were kind of market outlook meetings combined with some, financial considerations specifically to the ag sector. We held 6 in total. We kind of had a western grouping and then an eastern grouping across the state. So we visited Sheldon, Wall Lake, and Dunlap in early February. And then later in February, we went to Kalmar, Anamosa, and Fairfield, Iowa. Attendance was pretty good, really, this year at all those meetings. I'd say it was up probably 20-25% from last year's meetings across each region. We were just really happy with the turnout and the participation that we got from folks that did attend those meetings. Good questions were asked, and overall, I was pretty happy with it.
I would just add that attending these meetings is really important for the farmer members who do attend, but it also is really important for the work that Zach and I do, because we get to hear from members in a small group setting about what matters to them, like what they're concerned about, what questions they have. And we do pay special attention to the questions that folks asked, because that informs the educational opportunities that Zach provides in his role. And it also informs the research projects that I look at in my role.
Now, Zach, I understand you also gave a crop market update during that meeting. Can you talk us through a little bit of what you found and kind of what the outlook for this growing season is as far as crop prices?
Yeah, it was really just more of a crop market outlook. Trying to predict pricing is a pretty good way to get yourself into trouble pretty fast. In my career, I've heard several times the old saying that markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And so in February, we were looking at a situation where the USDA had come out in January and released a WASDE that really kind of upended markets. They showed up with a lot of extra corn acres and some half a bushel per acre more in production, which ended up really kind of changing the narrative of the corn market in terms of the production side. We just ended up having a lot more corn than people were anticipating, especially, the market in general was anticipating. And that sent prices lower. Since then, we've really gained a lot of that, all of that back, really, in the corn markets. And so one of the questions that I got at these meetings was specific to corn and soybean acreage and what we might see on a rotation this year. And so one thing that's happened, with the developments, we're all aware that, the issues that we're seeing in Iran right now and that conflict, what that's done to oil prices and fertilizer prices for that matter, more specifically. And so what your opinion might have been on corn acreage versus soybean acreage, back in February certainly looks different today as we've seen those fertilizer prices spike. And producers are still doing some math on those decisions there. So I would anticipate that we don't necessarily see the top end of what we might have seen for corn acreage probably got adjusted a little bit lower, if not significantly lower, given some of those developments.
And Christopher, you followed up with a fantastic overview of livestock markets during the meeting. Can you kind of share briefly what you covered and what you found?
I spent some time during these meetings talking about the hog market in Iowa and the cattle market in Iowa. And on the hog side of things, folks actually did have a pretty good 2025. The tagline that I used for that part of the presentation is that folks are quietly healing, because according to Iowa State's estimated returns to fair to finish hogs model that they have for Iowa, and that's curated by Lee Schultz up at Iowa State, in 2025, folks were estimated to have obtained $27 a head profit, essentially, like if you average all the months that we had in 2025. And that's up substantially versus $5 a head profit in 2024 and a loss of $24 a head in 2023. So a much better year in 2025, but folks were pretty quiet about it. So it's interesting to just kind of poke around what exactly was the cocktail of things that caused folks to return to profitability in that sector. And there are three main things. You had pretty steady supply on the hog inventory side of things. You had pretty steady demand at the retail counter and internationally, despite everything going on. And we also saw lower feed costs. So that's the silver lining of lower row crop commodity costs, is that it provides cheaper feed for cattle and hogs. One exciting aspect about the demand picture is that the early returns for the National Pork Board's Taste What Pork Can Do campaign, those early returns are very good because according to Pork Board CEO David Newman, for every $1 the Pork Board has invested in that program, they're seeing an incremental increase of $83 in retail pork sales, which I'm not really in the marketing world, but my understanding is that is really, really good. So returns are very good on that program, and that's exciting for the hog industry. Jumping over to cattle real quick, the cattle industry in Iowa had a very, very good 2025. Feedlots had a year for the record books with an average monthly return of $360 a head, according to Iowa State's models. It wasn't that long ago, though, that back in 2020 and 2021, we saw negative returns in 2020 and 2021 for the year. So to go from negative returns to $360 a head in a relatively short period of time is pretty amazing. And this comes down mostly to low cattle supplies combined with strong consumer demand. On the supply side, January 1 cattle report from USDA showed that the U.S. cattle herd shrank again, giving us the lowest cattle inventory that we've had in this country since 1951. And on the demand side, scanner data from Beef Research tells us that for demand, retail beef purchases were up both in total dollar spend, so the total amount of dollars that were spent in the economy on beef at the retail counter, and also on the pounds purchased. So both of those things going up in the same year. Again, they went up in 2024 is again pretty amazing to use that word. Those forces combined to a strong year for cattle folks in the state of Iowa.
I understand you also discussed ag lending during the meetings. What were the takeaways from those presentations?
Kind of a new aspect this year, we included regional local banks, ag lenders specifically, in the meetings. And so they got 45 minutes to an hour to just kind of give an overview of what they were seeing from the ag sector and producer behavior, and specifically then also answer any questions that producers had for them. And so, one of the main takeaways was just a greater emphasis on cash flow, cost controls, and marketing discipline, kind of an overview of working capital and the drawdown that we're seeing after several strong income years several years ago. The combined, multiple years now that we've had of tight to negative margins, specifically in row crops, is really starting to catch up with people. And so when you back up and kind of look at, where we're at today, again, the world's changed a lot in the past 40 to 60 days from, when these meetings were held. When you look at inputs specifically, the situation's gotten worse, not better from when these meetings were held. And so we're just going to be in an area here, again, thinking back to those meetings, we're just going to be in an area here where it's continually more important for producers to be really looking at that bottom line, communicating with their bankers, making sure that they have proper risk guardrails in place and that their marketing plans are being followed. And if and when we get to levels that we've made marketing plan decisions to do some execution on, that we go ahead and go through with that execution.
We also hear, especially during trying times like this, it's very important to stay in contact with your lender, with your banker. Why is that valuable to members at times like this?
It's just another guardrail. It's just another set of eyes and someone that specializes obviously in finance in general, but specifically ag finance, and is able to really look at, your overall portfolio of inflows and outflows and, maybe notice or point out some things that you might have overlooked and plan ahead for the future. 6 months from now, we will be in a different environment, and it could be either better than where we're currently at or worse than we're currently at. And so you kind of have to plan for both of those scenarios, and those lenders are there to help you kind of do that to make sure that, we are able to survive the tight times and prosper when things are better. When you look at $4.99 diesel, which was what I saw yesterday driving through Indianola, you're really talking about a shift in expenses there from where we were a month and a half ago. So that's just something to be aware of as we move forward here.
This is definitely another one of those years where you need to rely on your team of advisors. Zach talked at length about relying on your financial advisor, your banker, but it's also probably a year where you need to be in frequent contact with your risk management advisor. You need to be in frequent contact with your agronomist. You need to be in frequent contact with your team that you've put together to help make your production, financial, marketing decisions, from beginning to end. This is a year where you really need to lean on those folks. And unfortunately, we've had several of those years in a row, but it's just another year where that is very important.
Then after the regional meetings wrapped up, Zach, you led a group of Farm Bureau members to Texas for a market study tour. Now tell us about that trip.
Yeah, we flew into Dallas-Fort Worth. This was early March 9th through 12th. Kind of made our way down through San Antonio and then eventually flew back out of Houston, but had multiple stops along the way. Some of those were focused kind of on association type stops, and the rest of those were actual hands-on, in cattle lots and at producers' facilities in Texas. But so the trip's primary goal was really to talk about, discover, and socialize with Texas cattlemen about the issues they're facing, both with the Mexican live cattle ban that's been in place for nearly a straight year at this point, as well as the cause of said ban, which is the New World screwworm, and how that is impacting them via that closure, and also what the impacts could be if that was to be detected in the United States. Currently, it's still confined to Mexico. Some of the stops along the trip, we met with the Texas Farm Bureau. We met with a local veterinarian who also has a cattle operation on his farm there and talked with him about what he's seeing. We met with the Texas Beef Council, the Texas Southern Cattle Raisers Association, and several others along the way. And so a really high quality trip.
Now, Christopher, you've led these tours in the past, and obviously, notably last year, we went to the Netherlands. Can you tell us what the purpose of these tours are?
The purpose of the Iowa Farm Bureau Market Study Tours simply is to learn as much as possible, usually about some policy-relevant issue, and then to bring that information home to share with your family, neighbors, county farm bureaus, all those folks. There are just so many things that you can't learn about a place or about a culture unless you visit. There are just so many things about, in this case, Texas, that I'm sure you two who went on this trip wouldn't have been able to gather from the internet. You had to go there in person, shake some hands, look some folks in the eye, and hear about what's going on in their life. And it's those connections, often with farmers, that do produce the most interesting and important insights from these trips. There's just no substitute for that grassroots gathering of local information. The second stage of these trips is to bring that information back to Iowa and share it here. And that process adds immense value to our communities, to our understanding of complex issues like the New World screwworm situation and the border closing in Texas. Other market study tours have looked at really complex issues like Brexit and the EU climate policy environment. And all of these types of issues are just things that you can't possibly learn what you need to learn without going there in person and really diving into the subjects in an important way.
Yeah, on that note, we got back from the tour and I kind of unrelatedly had signed up for an artificial insemination class this past Saturday and Sunday. It was held at the community college over in Creston. And I got there, 12 other cattlemen in the course, and the presenter was Randy Dreyer, who had just been on the tour with me. So I was surprised. It was kind of like, hey, good to see you again, small world. And during that 2-day course, he actually took 15 minutes and updated the group on his Texas market study tour. And so it was good for me, just, kind of raw and unannounced, to really see the post-trip impacts, again, of those presentations and our members sharing that information that they learned on the trip with other, in this example, cattlemen. where the relevance was extremely present and visual. Another thing that made the trip exceptionally valuable to me was that it's not just presentations. I mean, a good presentation, it's worth quite a bit, but after a while, you kind of get tired of presentation after presentation after presentation. That's not what this trip is. It was conversations. And so our group was able to ask questions, compare notes, really understand how decisions are being made on the ground in Texas, which added a lot of additional value beyond a presentation type format.
Well, and one takeaway I had since I was able to go with you this year was that our members here at Farm Bureau ask really, really good questions. Did you hear from folks that they found this trip valuable? Was it well received?
Yeah, very well received. We actually had a post-trip survey, and so, without tooting my own horn too much, it was overwhelmingly positive. One thing that folks were asking for was some additional time at certain stops, and that's kind of what you get into when you're planning a Texas trip from your desk in Iowa. You're not sure which stops are going to be like good, and which ones are going to be great. And so all of the stops were good, but there were several that were great. And those are the ones where those conversations really took off. And due to time constraints, we had more questions, but we had to get on the bus and head out. And so that's the sign of a good tour from my perspective when people say we wanted more.
One of the things that both of you have already mentioned is the New World screwworm concern and the closure of the Texas-Mexico border. Christopher, can you kind of fill us in a little bit? I know you've done some research on this. What are some of the impacts of that border closure on Texas ranchers, and how is that being felt across the country in the cattle market?
As Zach mentioned earlier, the U.S.-Mexico border is closed to live cattle imports, has been closed for nearly a year at this point. The goal there is to hopefully delay the spread of the New World screwworm to the United States. Ultimately, the context there is that we don't have the sterile fly capacity to combat the pest effectively if or when it gets here on this side of the border. So the logic is that if we can delay its arrival by keeping the border closed to live animal imports, that our new sterile fly production facilities will be closer to operation, and then it can be mitigated more effectively with this additional sterile fly capacity that we have. Economically, the impact of this live animal border closure can be felt up and down the supply chain. At the feedlot side, we typically import more than 1 million head of cattle from Mexico annually, and many of them are feeder cattle that are placed in Texas feed yards. You folks visited some of those feed yards, and maybe you can chime in here about that. And there is serious concern that these feed yards, many of which are running far below optimal capacity levels, could close and that the feeding capacity shifts permanently south across the border.
Yeah. You're hearing about these sterile fly facilities. Why are they building sterile fly facilities? In the past, this has been proven to be a productive way to push back, if not eliminate, the issue with this New World screwworm. So the male mates multiple times. The female only mates once. And so by creating a sterile male that's going to go out and mate with multiple females, that's how you effectively can eradicate it and push it back. The larva that the female goes and finds any open tissue, so a scratch on a cow, a navel on a newborn calf, and it lays her larva, and that larva then begins digging into the skin. And so that's kind of the main difference. Most flies eat dead flesh. This specific fly, and larvae eat live flesh, I should say. The larvae eat the live flesh. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with and why we're so hyper vigilant about keeping it out of the United States. It can't survive our winters. So when you think about like Iowa specifically, it could get up here via, a trailer. It could get up here via a cow that was infected. The larva would fall out, get into the soil, and the cycle starts over again, creates the fly. But each winter, it would die off here and be pushed back south. So we do have that buffer here in Iowa specifically. That being said, it's kind of an annual reset, not a you're safe for the entire year type of situation.
Zach, it's my understanding that you and Corey visited some feed yards that were having capacity issues due to the lack of availability of Mexican feeder cattle.
Yeah. We visited 2 or 3 different operations. All of them were impacted to varying degrees. I'd say the biggest one was probably Graham Land and Cattle in terms of just visual capacity that wasn't being met. And you touched on it, but if you go do a little work looking it up, these cattle that are staying in Mexico, the Mexican feedlots are bursting at the seams, so to speak. We're under capacity here in the United States. You've got Tyson closing plants in Nebraska and reducing to one shift at one of the packing plants in Texas. Meanwhile, the Mexican government's come out and said, I think it's 32, give or take, $1 million worth of investment in additional high quality beef production capacity this year. And so you really got this shift taking place. And that's kind of my biggest takeaway from just everything I've learned, not only the trip, but everything I've learned the last 6 months related to this issue is we're doing all this work to keep the screwworm out by closing the border to cattle. Wild animals don't care about the border closure. And so there's this little deer called a nilgai, and it travels up to 100 miles a day. And so this thing is a carrier of it. And so what I'm worried about is that inevitably we end up with the New World screwworm in the United States. But by that point, we've really changed the structural dynamic of cattle processing, cattle packing, meat packing in the United States, and moved a lot of that capacity to Mexico and really shifted those supply chains and logistics, not only for now, but for the foreseeable future.
And if that all comes to fruition, that'll have impacts on our ability on this side of the border in the United States to rebuild our cattle herd, right? It's the carrot of strong returns on into the future that gets folks to retain heifers in order to rebuild their herds on their ranch, on their farm. And if you have this shifting of packing capacity south, all of a sudden, there isn't as much capacity on this side of the border that impacts returns up and down the supply chain, and there might not be as much incentive to rebuild the cattle herd here in the United States, which we're firmly stuck in a trough, as I laid out earlier.
Yeah, it's kind of a lose-lose situation currently for the U.S.
And one of the things I heard, especially from members, is just concerns about when you're looking at filling those feedlots in Iowa, it's hard to do when you're competing against guys now coming up from Texas to buy cattle because they can't get cattle in Texas and they need something to stock their yards with too. So is there any evidence that that's a real concern?
I don't know. Feeder cattle prices in the Midwest are as high as they've ever been. So that's definitely a price signal for you there that there's a lot of demand for not enough cattle.
My family has a cow-calf operation. And so I can understand if you're going to those sales trying to buy, those cattle to feed out, that's not a fun thing. It's been pretty fun for us going to the sales the last few years. But yeah, there's another side to every coin there. But that's kind of what we've just been talking about is if you have this shift, where does that all end up? If there's all this extra processing capacity down south being Mexico, how does that shift our entire supply chain, not only down in southern United States, but backed up, to your point, into the Midwestern regions? I mean, I don't think that's all been, at least I haven't flushed that out entirely. And so I think there's more questions there than answers.
Well, I would say it was a fantastic trip overall, and I learned a lot. And so, Zach, I appreciate your leadership on this tour. So thank you so much for that. And Christopher, before we wrap up today, please fill us in. We've got an economic summit coming up here this summer.
Yeah, this summer on July 17th in Ankeny, Iowa, we are once again hosting the Iowa Farm Bureau Economic Summit. We last held the event in 2024, and we took off 2025 in order to keep the event fresh. And here in 2026, it's going to be a great event and definitely worth the wait. The whole day is going to be dedicated to trade. We are going to be looking at the ongoing trade conversations and situations and policies from a number of different angles, from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. The theme of the event is called Trade Crossroads, the forces shaping the future of ag. And that certainly is what we're going to try to get at with each and every speaker is where have we come from? What is this crossroads we're standing at? Like, what are the different choices that we have from like a trade policy perspective, from a trade flows perspective? And then how is that going to shape agriculture in Iowa in the Midwest on into the future? We're very excited about our keynote speakers. Our keynote morning speaker is Bob Lighthizer. He's the former U.S. Trade Representative under the first Trump administration. And you can kind of think of him as the godfather of Trump trade policy. In the afternoon, we have the former chief ag negotiator from the first Trump administration, Greg Dowd, who now has a role with the National Milk Producers Federation. And then he's going to be talking about what the path forward for U.S. agriculture looks like. And we have a whole bunch of content in between those things as well. It's going to be a very exciting, dynamic event at the FFA Enrichment Center. A lot more information is available about that event online. Go ahead and get a ticket now for an early bird discount. Make sure to put it on your calendars, and it's not an event that you want to miss. It's definitely an event you want to be at.
Thanks, guys. Lots of evolving market conditions to track in the weeks ahead. As we close out this podcast episode, I'll echo Christopher's plug for Iowa Farm Bureau's 2026 Economic Summit, which will be July 17th in Ankeny. It's never been more apparent that we all need to be tuned in to the market-moving changes beyond our borders. And this year's Economic Summit is going to offer farmers deeper insight into the forces shaping the future of ag as we sit at a trade crossroads. There's a discounted rate for Farm Bureau members, and as Christopher mentioned, we're also offering a special early bird rate for those who register by May 31st. Learn more about the Economic Summit and get signed up using the link in the notes for this episode or at iowafarmbureau.com. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for our next episode on April 27th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.